Okay. So the first thing I want to kind of talk about here, and I'm going to be just focusing on theory first. So if you want to, have notes out and take some notes there, this would be a good time to do that. When I get to the second part, we'll do a little bit more of a hands-on example. I'll show you an example app. But for this first part, I'm just going to kind of talk through the theory and what the APIs look like. So the end goal of this is that I want you to be able to do two things. I want you to be able to prompt the user to confirm certain actions, such as certain actions they may want to maybe not do, or may need a second kind of level of confirmation. Often things are that, like, are you sure you want to log out when you're doing the sign out, or say you're deleting data, or sometimes also when you're editing or saving data. Those things may occur. Okay? So where this is going to tie in is, as far as the lab assignment goes, I'm asking you to do two things. Add a confirmation box to the sign out, as well as a confirmation box for deleting reviews, which is kind of a feature I'm also asking at the same time, because we don't have the option to delete reviews. So delete reviews and confirm that deletion, okay, before it happens. The other thing I want to talk about here, and this is partly split over today and Monday, is that I want you to be able to create some custom dialogues that can prompt the user for a little bit of information, maybe to proceed with operations. And so one of those cases that kind of applies well to our particular app is, say, hey, maybe I need to have you pick a console in a few different places. Such as if I add something in the library, I kind of want to say, hey, I want to add this for, I want to get this, I have this for Xbox, or if I add it to my wish list, I have it for PlayStation or whatever it may be. As well as a preferred platform maybe on your profile as well. So that's going to factor in a few different places, and that's that second bullet point. We'll talk a little bit about today in sort of the theory application side of things. And we'll do more hands-on on Monday. Okay? That's kind of a quick overview. This is probably the one that has the least amount of reading material. You'll notice I only have 2 links in here. One is to the Android Developer's Guide related to Dialogs, and the other is to the material design guidelines of, like, what are the standard expectations of how dialogues work, when you should use them, when you shouldn't, etc., things like that. Okay, it can be a little bit fishy, it can be a little bit harder, especially in the mobile world, to figure out when you should use a dialogue and when you should use something else. Because, for instance, in reality, anything that you can do with the dialogue, you can also do with an activity, right? The difference is the dialogue is just kind of a small thing that appears on top of wherever you are, so it's a good way to ask a quick question, versus an activity is a little bit more heavyweight, and so it's more appropriate when you have a larger workflow that the user needs to do, right? So it's usually only appropriate for, like, a single question, and that's it. If you have more than one question, or more than one thing that you need the user to fill out, it's usually better to just go ahead and make that an activity. Okay? So there's a limited sort of space where this happens, and again, a lot of these cases could be done with either a dialogue or an activity, so when you decide to use it is kind of important. Okay, let's talk about first what a dialogue is. So a dialogue is a small window that prompts the user to make a decision or enter some additional information. A dialogue does not fill the screen and is normally used for modal events that require the user to take an action before they can proceed. So, for instance, here you can see there's 2 example dialogues that we've got here. One on this left is you can see the header, they're picking from a spinner, this kind of rolling thing, a number, and then they've got kind of an OK or a set and a cancel button, right? The confirmation, you might say that the positive button is the set and the negative button is the cancel, okay? Or a quick confirmation dialog. You can kind of, again, see the header, maybe with an icon. It says, hey, are you sure you want to erase your storage because you're going to lose files, right? And so then you can say either, yes, I do want to erase it, or no, I want to cancel it. Cool? So those are what we're kind of talking about. The point is that they appear kind of on top of an activity that you have, but they don't appear full screen, right? They don't take up the entire screen real estate. They're just a small portion of that real estate. Okay? Okay. So the base class for all of these dialogs is always the dialog class. We actually don't use the dialog class directly hardly ever because A, we don't need to, there's some better subclasses, and it's just generally not standard practice to use the dialog class itself directly. So we generally use the subclasses of the dialog instead. So there's three main subclasses today you can use. One is the AlertDialog, and actually that's the most common one. That can include a title, include up to 3 buttons on the bottom. It could include a selectable list in the middle, or a layout in the middle, or even any kind of custom layout you want to include. So for instance, both of these here, those are both variants of an AlertDialog. Okay, that tends to be 90% of the time, if you need a dialog, it's going to be an AlertDialog in some way, shape, or form. There's 2 other customized special ones that are available, namely the date picker dialog and the time picker dialog, for specific cases where, hey, I need to pick a date or I need to pick a time. So those are usually used anytime you need that particular functionality. It's worth mentioning that because of kind of complexities with picking the dates and times, those are very rarely done as actually an input field. Input fields are usually not very user-friendly on a mobile environment because there really just isn't enough place for all the controls and things that you need to do. So on web and desktop, you might be used to doing date and time pickers kind of in the same screen or having a text box for that. That doesn't really usually work out for mobile. Okay, so usually if we do have a case where we need to do pick a date on the pop-up of one of these dialogs, it's going to give the user a nice interface to go through years and dates and months, etc. So that's what we expect, and if I wanted to pick a time, I would then use this dialog as well. So oftentimes these are used kind of in concert. You might have one field for, here, click this button to pop up a date picker, click this button to pick up a time picker, and then kind of together you have a date and time. Cool. Those are not our focus for today, but what we're focused on is the AlertDialog. But it's worth mentioning that those are out there, and some of the principles and practices that we talk about here do apply if you're picking dates and times. Okay? They apply to that as well. All right, so let's talk about how we build an AlertDialog. So AlertDialog, you can kind of see AlertDialog is the base class and the main thing that we're going to use for the dialogues we're talking about here. It allows us to build a wide variety of designs, and is often really turns out to be usually the only dialog you need. The outside cases of being the date picker and the time picker. In this image here, you can kind of see the layout of it. So up here we've got what we call the title. This middle area is called the content area, and then you've got what are called action buttons at the bottom. Okay, so it's a quick breakout of what we do. You can see in this case that they have both text and icons. You freely do those kind of things. We're not going to focus too much about icons, but you can put an icon up there if you want as well. The content area, we basically have kind of 3 things to choose from. We can either just put a message there, just a string. We can put a list of options, or we can put a custom layout, which is what they've done here. They have a checkbox and a slider, and so they're kind of putting that together for a custom layout. One thing that might be weird if you pay attention to the buttons, notice that the OK button is on the right and the cancel button is on the left. That's actually backwards of what Windows usually does. Usually on Windows, the OK button is on the left and the cancel button is on the right. Why might that be different on Android? Why might that be backwards? Yeah, that's actually, it actually comes down to that, is most people are right-handed. And so you put the OK button on the right because it's easier to get to. So that's just standard practice with Android, is usually you have your positive button on the right and your negative button on the left. Okay? There's also a neutral button, which we'll talk about, which you can put here in the middle, which is a third option that comes up sometimes in terms of like a kind of a third thing you might want to do. If it's not okay or cancel, you might have a maybe button in the middle. Okay. One note on the header, on the title. You don't always need a title. In fact, a lot of dialogues shouldn't necessarily have one. One of the things that they say is if all you're showing is maybe just a short message, or it can be easily explained by just what's in the content area, then you should just have the content area and not the header. Generally, we should have the header if it adds something to it. So common case where you might have a header, if we have a list here in the middle, then we definitely want a header, because the list by itself doesn't tell us much. Or if we do a custom layout, then we also definitely want a header. So in this case, it definitely adds having the brightness here, but if we have a case where, say, it's just a, hey, are you sure you want to sign out, it may not make sense to have title and then message as well. One common misnomer is sometimes people will put the actual message in the header. So you have the header and then a shorter message in the middle. The expectation is the longer thing is in the middle and in the content area, and the short bit of text is in there. Okay? As I mentioned, there can be 1 to 3 action buttons on the bottom. So far we've just seen 2 because that's the most common. And on that note, you can also just have 1, right? So oftentimes if you're just trying to tell the user something and then it goes away, there might just be an OK button and that's it. Cool? Or you're saying, hey, something failed, there might just be a cancel button and nothing else, depending on what the context of the dialog you're showing. So the AlertDialog class itself, we usually don't work too much with that class directly. In fact, we don't usually subclass either the AlertDialog or the dialog class itself. When we want to make our custom layouts or design our dialogs, what we actually use is this builder class called AlertDialog.builder. Okay, you've kind of seen this pattern in maybe some other places. This happens a lot in Android, where we use a builder to kind of construct the thing we want. At the end, it will construct the alert dialog, and then from there we have an alert dialog. It just turns out to be a lot more convenient in a lot of ways for Android to do it that way, rather than forcing you to subclass again and again and again, which is oftentimes what we do otherwise. Okay. So first step in order to build the dialog and get one on screen is we need to construct AlertDialog.builder object that takes a context. Okay, so you have to have a context in order to do this. Because it's UI, generally speaking, you're all going to work with this AlertDialog in 2 contexts. You're either going to be in an activity or you're going to be in a fragment. So this is never something that you want to do from a view model or other classes like this. Or an adapter. Occasionally you may need to do it from an adapter, but that's usually something to kind of be cautious of. But large in part, it's going to be the activities and the dialogues where these are going to get. Activities and fragments is where you're going to create these. Cool? Okay. Yeah, adapter does happen sometimes, such as if you're doing it. So from the builder, then we can start customizing the alert dialog that we want. So for instance here, I can call the setTitle method and add a title to it. If I don't call setTitle, then it just won't have a title. I can call setMessage to put the message in the middle. If I don't do that, there will still be a content area. It just will basically be empty. You should always set something for the content. You don't always need to have a title, but you always should have a content area with stuff in it. So setTitle, setMessage, and then in terms of adding buttons, I could say let's set positive button, which would add our OK button. And so for the positive button, I need to specify 2 things. Both the text for that button and a listener for that button. So here I'm saying that the text of that button should be OK, and that here's my function, call me when the user clicks on OK. So it receives a dialog and an integer we call which. That which tells you basically what button they clicked on, what item they picked from the list potentially. We'll kind of talk about that in a minute. Okay, it's usually, you usually don't need to do a lot with either of those arguments, if anything. Okay, the negative button, you can see I'm putting the text in again, same idea, same handler, right? So if you want to add a button, you just need to provide both of those pieces of information. It's a little bit unusual because that's not usually how you set things up, such as buttons. Usually you add the button to the layout, or you set the button of the text of it, and then you add the click listener later. It turns out with this is you're just adding them both at the same time, okay? Because inherently, if you're going to have a button there, then that button basically needs to do something, right? So if you're going to add an OK button, or if you add a cancel button, then there has to be a function there that can be called when the user clicks on that, okay? It's a non-optional thing. So once we've called all those setters and we designed the dialog that we want, our third step here is what we're going to do is called builder.create. Builder.create will create the actual AlertDialog object that we want. So from here I have a dialog instead of a builder, okay? Just like other things, toast messages and snack bars, if you just construct the thing, it doesn't appear to the user. So you do have to remember as the very last step to call show on that dialog you just created. Cool? That's the step that most people forget to do, is to show it there. Another thing to recognize here too as well, remember we've kind of talked about asynchronous code. There's a lot of stuff that we're doing asynchronous. This is another one of those cases, right? So none of these functions here are blocking, right? When I get to the end of show after this line, the dialog's not even going to be on screen yet, let alone has the user clicked an option or another. So if I need to run code, where I need to run code after the user's picked an option, which is basically always the case, we have to make sure that that code doesn't happen down here. We have to make sure it happens in these listeners, right? So you're going to find yourself nesting things again, where you say, okay, the user says, I want to sign out. You go show the dialog, and then the code that actually logs them out needs to be in here. It needs to be in that listener. Does that make sense? Otherwise, if you put it down here, you're going ahead and logging them out before users even had a choice, right? Before they've even had a chance to answer the question, okay? That's one of the kind of most common mistakes that people make, is they're again thinking in the synchronous mindset, where if I just write code top to bottom, that's the order that things will happen in, but it doesn't work that way, okay? So, let's talk about the action button specifically. So there's 3 buttons we can add. I kind of talked about some of these already. There's a positive button, there's a negative button, and there is a neutral button, okay? And these are generic intentionally because oftentimes it's not okay or cancel. Oftentimes you want that positive button to say, hey, I'm going to do this, right? You saw in the examples, I want to erase, I want to log out, I want to delete the thing. So oftentimes that verb that's in the positive button shouldn't just be okay, it should be, here's the action I'm going to do, right? Vice versa, oftentimes negative. This will usually just be cancel, because usually negative just says, hey, I don't want to do the thing that I was going to do. I want to abort out of it. But sometimes it may be yes and no, because it may still be that something has to happen either way, and so we just choose to do this or do the other thing. Cool? So oftentimes these will be okay and cancel. That's kind of a simple case, but do pay attention to what the text is. Oftentimes you can make the dialogue more readable if you use some other verbs, especially on the positive side. Now, the neutral side. This is one that appears in the middle. And we use this anytime the user kind of wants to do, they don't want to do, if you have users that might want to say, I don't want to do the positive, and I don't also want to do the negative, okay? So examples of this might occur if you say have an update you're applying. You might say, yes, apply the update now, or no, the negative would be no, I never want to apply that update. You might have a middle, neutral, that says, don't update it right now, ask me about it tomorrow, right? or ask me about it later. So that's oftentimes what that middle option might be is say, don't abort out of it, just maybe we'll do it later. Cool? As far as what I'm asking you to do, none of those tasks are going to involve a neutral button, so you don't need to worry about it too much. They are, in fact, pretty rare that we do need one, right? So you usually have some pretty complex scenarios by the time you need that middle button, okay? So remind me later is one of those. It's worth noting you can only add one of each of those button types. So I can only have one positive button, I can only have one negative button, I can only have one neutral button. You also can't change the order of those buttons. Positive button is always on the right, negative button is always on the left, the neutral button is in the middle. So that's intentional because there's a certain user expectation, standardization, that the position of the button tells the user whether it's positive or negative. So there's a built-in user expectation that you should follow, right? So don't have your OK button be on the left and your cancel be on the right, just because that's what you feel like today. There is an expectation of standardization there. Cool. So the way we set up those buttons are there's three different methods we can call on the alert builder. We can call set positive button, which takes the text and a listener. We've got set negative button, and we've got set neutral button. All three of these take that listener as the second side, second parameter, which takes a dialog and that integer which. So it's kind of like a on-click listener, but it actually isn't the usual on-click listener interface. The first parameter there can either be a string, or it can be an ID for a string resource. So once you get to translating, actually you would usually want that to be an ID, right? A string ID, but it can actually be either. There's two overloads for it. Okay, one thing to mention historically that I found is that you need to provide both the text and the listener. If either of those are null, then your button doesn't work. Historically is what has been my experience. So if I give a cancel button but I don't give a listener, then nothing happens when you hit the cancel button, for instance. If I give an OK text but no listener, nothing happens when I hit OK. Cool? Okay. Or it won't be shown. So the next thing we can do, in terms of the content area, oftentimes we may just want to show a message. Sometimes I want to give some additional options for the user. So one thing we can do is we can build these sort of list dialogues as well. So in this case, we've got a dialog. You can see it's got a header. It's got three options, so I can pick red, green, or blue, right? So this here in the middle is still the content area with three options. There actually are no action buttons you can see at the bottom, right? There's no OK and cancel. So the way that one works, this is called the kind of the traditional single choice list, right? The user just picks one of those options and it proceeds. There's no second, like, click the option and then click OK. Cool. That works well for easy things, simple things that don't really have a lot of consequence. So I click it, and I can, if I click the wrong option, I can just hit back and go to the previous screen, right? That's usually okay. Or if I don't need this to remember what I picked previously, this also works. But in the cases where maybe there's a more significance to what they pick, or if we need to kind of remember and show what they had picked previously, usually what we'll do is one of these other options. There are persistent choice options. So in this case, this screenshot you're seeing is one with checkboxes. So I can check more than one topping. So lettuce and tomato is what they've got checked here. And then once I've picked all my choices, I'm going to go hit OK. I can do the same thing with just a single choice. These would just be radio buttons instead of the checkboxes. Cool. So there's actually three different dialogues that you can create, three different kinds of list. I'm only showing two of them here. Okay? Questions right now? Does that kind of make sense? One thing to note here, these specific list choices are really meant to be for a very small number of lists. They're ideal for a very small number of choices, okay? Why do I say that? So if you have a large number of choices, you should just go to an activity. As a general rule of thumb, if you have a large enough number of choices that it needs to scroll, you're probably better off just making an activity so that you have the choice of adding filters and other things like that, okay? So this is really only suitable for a small number of options, say maybe 2 to 5, maybe 7 would kind of fit in here. If you're having more than 7 options, I would probably just say you need to use an activity with a recycler view. Cool? Does that make sense? So in this case, they've got 3 options, so they both kind of fit into that. Okay. A lot of times, dialogs like this could also be represented as a spinner, and so in some ways they kind of serve the same function as spinner. They're good for a small number, a relatively small number of choices. Questions? So for both of these, we expect the persistent versions, whether radio buttons or checkboxes, we do expect an OK cancel at the bottom. For this one, this version, we don't have it. It's just a one click. One case where you might see this common one up here, we had talked kind of briefly about, what if I wanted to do one button for camera or gallery, picking a profile photo. That would be a good place to maybe pop up a dialog and say, hey, just choose here or there. I'm not asking you to change that. I want you to just keep this 2 separate buttons, but that is one place that we could use this. Cool? All right, let's talk about how we implement those things. So the first one, the traditional single choice, looks kind of like this. Just like before, I'm going to create the builder. I'm going to construct a builder object. I'm going to call set title to say what the title text is here. So I'm using the string resource I have here called pick color. And I'm going to call set items with an array, a string array resource that I created previously, which is colors. So it's really just call set title, call set items. Set items also takes a listener, and what else did I need to mention? This basically comes in place of set message. So you can't have both a message and a list of items in the middle. It's neither. If you do need a message and a list, then you have to create really a custom layout, a custom dialog, right? Now out of the box, you just get one or the other. Okay? So that's all we really have to do. Take the builder, call create, and then show, and that dialog is now on screen. Right? So that case is pretty simple. Okay. In this case, which variable will tell us which option that user picked. So if they pick the first option, it leaves 0. Second option, 1, 2, etc. Cool. So those are pretty easy to spawn and set up, but they're always going to look like this. You don't really have necessarily a lot of control of how they look. You don't get to provide a layout for the items. All it can do is show a string. Right, and so you do have to have an array of strings. You can't just give it, say, array of consoles or array of games or array of people. It does have to be an array of strings for this to function. Okay. Next up, we'll talk about the persistent single choice list. Okay. This is similar to the first one, except that now it's going to have an OK and cancel button, and there's going to be a radio button in there. It's going to kind of show us what the currently selected item is. So I start out by creating a builder again. The difference here, instead of calling set items, I'm calling set single choice items. Set single choice items. I'm giving it an array again, a string array resource. There's a second parameter here. That second parameter will say what is currently selected. So if I want, say, in this dialog, let's say I wanted lettuce to be selected, then it would pass in as 1, right? Or 2 if I wanted tomato selected. If I want nothing selected, then I just pass in -1. So it gives you a choice to say what is currently selected. Cool. So here I'm just starting this as say -1. Oftentimes I would need to persist that. Remember what the user had picked previously and use that next time I spawn the dialog. Okay? From there, so we call set title, set single choice items, and then I'm going to add a positive and negative button just like we did before. It's worth mentioning here, this listener is pretty important to capture what the user selected, because we need to kind of keep track of what is the user selected until finally they hit OK. One of the big cautions here, don't initiate the action when this one fires. Just say what their choice is. Because until they hit OK, they haven't confirmed or said, yes, I want to do that thing. That's a common misnomer, is to fire off the code in here. That code needs to wait. OK? So it could be that they pick a choice, and then they hit cancel and go back and decide, I'm not going to do that. Similarly for the multi-choice is kind of a similar setup. I'm going to create a builder. I'm going to call set title, set multi-choice. Now the difference with multi-choice is it actually, again, like the single choice, it takes 2 arguments. Okay? The first one is an array of strings, or specifically an array of care sequences. The second one is an array of booleans. So you pass in an array of strings, basically, and an array of booleans. Okay? That array of booleans tells it what items are initially checked. Okay? So that means I had to do a little setup up here first. I had to say, OK, let's call get resources, and then get text array. And we'll pass in my array, actually that should be our array pick toppings. I think that, is that the right? Oh, no, our array toppings. That's what should be there. So it's an array, has to be a string array. One thing I might mention here is, notice it's taking an array of care sequences. One of the things that means is that I can actually have formatted options in here. They don't just necessarily have to be plain text. You can put formatted text in here. It does support that. Cool. So that means you can put like your HTML tags into your resources, make things bold or italic, change the colors a little bit, and that will work. So first things first, I create that. I then need to create an array of booleans. That array of booleans needs to be the same length as the array of options. So here I'm just creating that array. When I create a new array in Java, those are all defaulted to false. So right now, if I just went this way, all of those items are going to be unchecked. If I say needed to remember what the user had picked before, then I would need to go into that array of booleans and set those things to true. Cool? Make sense? So oftentimes there may be a little bit of extra code in here to maybe remember or restore what the user had picked previously. But in general, I need to create those 2 arrays. Okay? Once we get into this listener is a little bit different from multi-choice. It actually takes 3 arguments. The dialog object, which index that you're selecting or unselecting, and a third variable telling you whether they checked it or unchecked it. Okay? So the easy way that I can implement this, I can just say, OK, I now know the index and what the value is. So when we handle that, I'll just say, let's take that checked items array. I'll find out the index, take the index that they clicked on, and we'll set it to the new value. That's actually usually all you need to do here, is just switch that over. Occasionally, you may need to do a little bit more if you've got some things you need to show visually. So if, for instance, if you need to change the background color or things like that, you might want to change colors, foreground or background colors, you might do that there as well. But that's usually all you need to do. Notice that I'm not kicking off whatever the action is at that point. I'm just remembering what the user chose. Okay? Then I'm adding a positive and a negative button, and that's where our handling would be. So if once the user's picked all those things, this is where we're actually going to, in that OK listener, in that positive button listener, that's where it actually initiate the action using that checked items array. Does that make sense to everybody? So that's not necessarily too hard to set up. It does become a little bit more difficult if you want to customize the layout per se, but it's pretty easy offhand. So now let's talk about custom layouts. So sometimes it may be that those options before don't work for you. Maybe you don't want just a string. Maybe you don't want just a list of options, right? Maybe I need my own layout that I can stick in the middle in the content area. And the good news is I can actually just put any sort of layout I want there, right? I can design it in there, use a constraint layout, design whatever layout I want, and just stick it in this dialog. So for instance here, what they have is a nice kind of custom header up at the top. You can see it's got a different font, and it's centered. We've got a username field, we've got a password field. So it's kind of like a login dialog. And then a positive button for sign in, and a negative button for cancel. Now it's worth noting that this dialog, the way it's set up, doesn't actually have a traditional header. The header that they're putting in here is actually part of the custom layout. Everybody tracking with me there? That's how the layout looks different, is it's not actually the normal title. So in order to set this up, we have to first create a new layout resource file, which is going to model what we want the content area to be. We're going to then, we basically have to inflate that layout, which we'll show you how to do that in code. And the last part is that we need to then attach that inflated layout to the dialog builder by calling setView. So you basically have a few different options you can call for setting the content, right? So in terms of setting content, we can set message, we can set items, we've got set single choice items, or set multi-choice items, or finally the one we're talking about is set view. We can use any of those 5 methods to set what appears in the content area. But you only get to pick one. That's the important thing to make sure you understand. If you call one of those and then call the second one, you will get an exception on the second one because the content area can only be one thing. Cool? So this last one is kind of our escape hatch to say if any of those 4 options don't work for us, we can just do our own thing. Okay? So let's look at the layout file that they created for this particular custom dialog. Okay, they've set it up with a linear layout. It can really be any layout you want, but here they're using a linear layout. Notice that the width and height on that are wrap content. That part's pretty important, right? The fact that it's wrap content for both the width and height says only be as big as you need to be. If I set those both to match parent, then the whole dialog would get as big as the screen, right? But it's a dialog. It shouldn't take up the entire screen. So it's important to make sure that you set the width and height of that layout to wrap content. We can see the next thing that's in there is an image view. That image view is the text or the banner that's appearing above. And so if I look at it a little bit closer, you can see there's an image. The image is actually just the text that's appearing at the top. There's a width and height, so it's as wide as the dialog is, and it's always at a fixed height of 64. That would be kind of relative to what the image size is. They're centering the image, so it's appearing in the middle. And then they are saying a background color of yellow. So the yellow is actually that background color. The white text is actually an image. Everybody clear with that? Okay. And then finally, we have a content description, which is the application name. And they're using that because this image otherwise would not be accessible. Because screen reader can't read the text that's in the image. So anytime you have an image with text in it, it's important to put a content description which provides the same text that's in that image. Okay? Next up, we've got edit text. The edit text is just simply defining the username field. And we've got another edit text, which is defining the password field, right? So it's a pretty simple layout, right? But you can maybe see how you could extend this and do really whatever layout you wanted to. Cool? Okay, now let's talk about how that fits in with the code. So the first thing I need to do is, in order to use this sort of custom layout, I need to actually get an inflator first. And actually, I think this code is actually wrong.
Isn't it layout_inflator.from or something?
Yeah, it's usually from. Should be that. I think I found that in my prepping of this and forgot to change it here. So I'm going to say layout_inflator from, pass it a context, which again kind of means I need to have a context to do this process. That inflator, then I can say inflator.inflate, pass it in my layout, null for the parent and false for attach it to the parent. Both of those I'm not going to specify the parent because the parent doesn't exist yet. And I'm not going to tell it to attach to the parent because, again, the parent doesn't exist yet. So right now I'm just creating the layout and it's floating out in the middle of nowhere, not in the UI yet. Does that make sense? So that will then give me back a view, which is the layout that we designed, right? So I say layout.sign-in dialog or whatever custom layout I need, okay? From this layout, I can then call find view by ID and grab out the particular fields within there that I might want to access in code. So here I'm saying find view by ID, get the username field, find view by ID, get the password field, save those both to variables, right? And then I can finally actually create the dialog. So I have a little bit of setup that I have to do in this case before the dialog bin can be created. Does that make sense for everybody? So you have to create the layout, find the views first, and then we can finally get in here. Okay. So here we're saying let's set view. Notice there's no set title here because there's no actual title to this dialog. That's just part of the content there. Okay. But you can do both. You can have the regular title, like calling set title, and not do that, which would usually be the normal case. Usually you just use a built-in title. So I call set view to set content, and then just like before, I just set up my positive and my negative buttons, and finally we build a create shelf. Make sense? So this gives you that ability to do whatever you need to do, right? I can set listeners on these views if I need to respond to events on them, and I can initiate whatever action I need to do once the positive or the negative buttons are clicked. Cool? Questions? Does that make sense on the custom dialogs? You can see how that makes this a lot more flexible. You're not just limited to this. This also means because of how this is set up, I actually never need to subclass dialog or dialog in general. I usually just end up using this alert builder because it turns out to be a lot more convenient even for these custom cases. Cool. It's also worth mentioning there's an older way to do dialogs that isn't really done much anymore, but used to be one way that we would do custom dialogs. You can actually make an activity and then kind of turn that activity into a dialogue. The way you do that is there's actually themes you can apply. We haven't talked about theming yet, so I don't want to go too deep into this right now. But it used to be one way that people would do this is we'd create an activity, give it a theme that makes it look like a dialogue, and so that would kind of appear as a box, right? It just would be kind of smaller. You have all the same behavior as if it was an activity, but you could kind of see it would be transparent on the outside. So you have like black, kind of partially transparent on the outside. So it would kind of be an activity that would show the other activity behind it. So that was one way that we used to do this. It's less supported now, and we haven't talked about theming, so I don't want to go into what that is. But just to know that that is an option, right? There are ways to do that. If you need something much more complicated, that needs to really be an activity, but maybe you don't want it to look like an activity. There is that flexibility. Last topic that we need to talk about in the theory is talking about how we dismiss the dialogue. Okay, so we haven't really talked about how the dialogue goes away yet. So by default, actually, when the user clicks on the positive, the negative, the neutral, if they click on any of those action buttons at the top, the application will automatically dismiss it for you. That you get out of the box. Okay. So usually it's just a matter of like, okay, I hook up my code that does a thing when I hit OK, and it just automatically goes and dismisses it for you. Okay. It's also possible that this sometimes comes up. Also, if you're doing the traditional single choice one, right, that would be this variant that you get with set items instead of this variant. This variant does actually also auto dismiss it. So when the user picks an option from here, it will automatically send the dialog away, versus this one does not dismiss the dialog when you click on an option. Okay. It's also possible that you might decide to cancel a dialog. You say, hey, I've popped up the dialog, but I've changed my mind. I want to take that dialog away. You can call cancel on the dialog object itself, and that will take it away. So you can do that explicitly. Other ways that this can get dismissed, if the user presses the back key on their keyboard, that will cancel the dialog as well. Or if they touch the black area, the gray area outside of the dialog, that will also cancel the dialog. Now it's worth mentioning, if you call cancel, if you press back, if you press that black area, all of those do not trigger your negative button. All of those do not trigger your negative button. So you're just canceling, that's a different event. Okay. So if you need to respond to those other cases where the dialog might be canceled, you need to add another listener. So we can say set on cancel listener and say, here's the code I want to run if the dialog is canceled. Most of the time, both in the negative case, if they click the cancel button or if they cancel the dialog in any other way, we don't usually need to do anything in those cases. So oftentimes we're just going to not hook that up. Because usually we say, hey, let's confirm it before we actually do the thing. But if you're midway through, saying, doing an operation, and then you need to ask the user a question, you might have some cleanup you need to do to make sure things get back into a good state. Does that make sense? So for an example of that might be, hey, you started to upload the user's profile picture. Maybe you got part of the way where it got uploaded to storage, but it didn't actually update the auth database. You might want to show them a confirmation dialog to say, okay, I failed to update the database. Do you want me to try again, or do you want me to back out, right? And so I might be in a place there where I need to do something in the cancel case. That makes sense? So I can listen to those events if I need to listen to those events as well. So that's the theoretical side of things. That's what you need to know about dialogs. Okay. Are there any questions right now?
Pretty simple.
Pretty simple. Overall, the API is pretty easy to work with. Mm-hmm. So that gives you kind of a quick overview. Let's go ahead and take a quick break, and then we'll come back and I've got a kind of a more hands-on example I'll show real briefly.